Hi, I'm Marilyn Darling from Fourth Quadrant Partners. In this video, I want to talk about a principle of emergent learning, maximizing freedom to experiment. First, I want to put the idea in context for you. Emergent learning is not just a bag of learning tools. It goes way beyond how we normally think about learning. Emergent learning is a way to think about how to strengthen our strategy and all of the actions we take together in order to achieve our goals, especially when we're navigating very complex and highly turbulent environments like we're facing today in the social sector. Emergence is about creating a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts, as we often say, and so is emergent learning. So today we want to shift our focus from the tools of emergent learning to the principles of emergent learning. And first, I want to say that they do not come from any one theory or a book, and they're not set in stone. They really represent what we've observed over the years and heard ourselves talking about over the years. So they're highly emergent and they're highly connected. It's really hard to talk about any one of them at a time, but today I do want to try and talk about maximizing freedom to experiment. So let's get started. Now, when you were a child, you had to learn how to walk and you had to learn to maybe play the piano. When you were older, you might have studied physics, and then you learned how to be a good parent, and you learned how to do your job. All of these things are part of who you are. How did you do all of that? So if you think about how you learned how to walk, your mommy or your daddy could hold you up and help you walk for a while, but at a certain point, they had to let go and you had to do it on your own. You had to learn how to hold your balance. And in the process, you had to fall down a lot. You had to experiment. Once you mastered that, you learned how to run and jump and skip and all the other things that you learned how to do as a kid. So for everything you've mastered, really, you've had to experiment. You have to put the book down and you have to try it out in your work, in your life, and see what works and what doesn't work. If you don't experiment and do only what's exactly been told you or taught to you or written in the book, you cannot adapt, you cannot prepare for unexpected things to happen. You can't really build mastery around a particular skill. So let's think about that in the context of our social goals. If we can only do as a group what we've been trained to do or told to do, we're never going to get to our goal, particularly in these complex environments we find ourselves in. So you need a goal, but you also need the ability to detour when you find a roadblock in your way. So we talk about this as having strong line of sight, which is another principle of emergent learning, and freedom to experiment. The more you can pair these two, the faster we're able to learn and adapt as we navigate these complex waters. Now, it's interesting, one of the places that we really first observed this combination was at the National Training Center where the After Action Review was born. The National Training Center is the premier training facility out of the Mojave Desert that the Army uses particularly for brigades to be able to prepare before they deploy to a war zone. And that's where the AAR was born. And the reason it was born was after Vietnam, the Army realized we can't do this again. We need to shift from a command and control culture that we're so known for to be able to be adaptive to the highly unpredictable environments of a war zone. So we were fortunate enough to be able to go out to the National Training Center and see this for ourselves. And what we observed was what was happening after 20 years of practice. These soldiers had been doing after action reviews almost literally every day for 20 years. Imagine if you practiced an after action review for 20 years around something you care about, how skilled you would become. So what we observed was that after they had done AARs for so many years, they had learned some things. And one of them was kind of a paradox. It was called commander's intent. What happened was they had observed for years and years in AARs, they would hear things like, "But sir, you told me to take the hill and that's what I did." So what they discovered is that if they separate out the specific tactic and the larger purpose in a command, every time they gave a command, they would create space for adaptation. We think of this as a difference, as separating out the if and the then of a hypothesis. Soldiers were expected to experiment until they got it right. And the whole change in the culture really kind of blew through our assumptions about what it meant to be in the Army. And it really holds some lessons for us in the social sector. So we want to shift back to talking about our work in the social sector. Now, what we've seen when we've observed in our own work, in our research, is that if you have strong line of sight, but don't have freedom to experiment, it really slows down learning. This can happen in the name of being strategic. When a person or an organization in a position of power insists on aligning around a particular strategy. This can happen if a senior staff dictates what the strategy is going to be and hands it down to junior staff. But even more importantly, it shows up in the power dynamics between funders and grantees, where funders create grant requirements that contain all sorts of expectations to do things in a particular way that constrain the ability of grantees to experiment and do things, to adjust things to fit their environments. So the more committed a group is to a particular strategy, the harder it is to challenge it, the harder it is to notice or talk about what's working and what's not working, and hence the longer it takes to learn. So on the flip side, a kind of do your own thing approach, which is very common in a high autonomy environment, means that you have lots of freedom to experiment, but not strong line of sight. And what we've observed is when you have that, you can have 1,000 flowers blossoming, but you're not making progress towards a particular goal. And we've actually also seen it result in a lot of infighting for resources with no really good way to make a decision besides who has power. So what works better? If you think about your own work, if you're the one who's in a position of power, notice where are you dictating strategies where you really might be able to instead separate out the what and the how, the goal and the tactic, and give people the freedom to experiment with the how. It's not always possible because, there's often strategies require a real intensive a collection of resources, but it's also really easy, and we've seen this happen, that a group with the best of intentions to support learning and adaptation wanders over the line between the what and the how and starts to dictate things to grantees or to people within the organization, particularly if there's an exciting new idea. In fact, often what happens is that it's not just one idea, but lots of great ideas get layered on top of each other because, it's all good, but it can constrain learning. So now if you're on the receiving end of that, what would it take for you to create more freedom for yourself? What if you were able to hear and ask questions about the goal and reinforce your understanding and commitment to that goal and communicate that you're open to talking about what you're learning along the way if you're given freedom to experiment? This is how the soldiers at the NTC do it. They're given the freedom to experiment, to do what they think will work best. And in return, they come to their AARs ready to talk about what worked and what didn't work. And literally say, this was my success today. Here's why I think I succeeded, and here's what I'm going to do to take that forward. Here's where I think I fell on my behind, and here's what I'm going to do because of that. And they just talk about that without any compunction, and it's really remarkable to see. So here's some things that you can try out. First, ask framing questions. What would it take to? If you ask a question like that, it communicates an invitation to the people around you, to your partners, to your grantees, to your employees. It creates an invitation for them to experiment, to explore the space and conduct experiments. It communicates that that there's no one right answer, and it's our job to learn together how to get to a particular goal. Then, of course, hold some before and after action reviews, which turn work into a learning experiment. They invite everyone involved in the action to participate in that experiment. Practice turning strategies into if-then hypotheses. And when you're faced with what feels like a command to pursue a particular strategy, try opening up the conversation. Help me understand what we're trying to accomplish here. It's one of our favorite questions. I started out today by talking about how you learned to walk and how you had to fall down a lot to do that. You had to experiment and develop the freedom and power to learn and adapt. So emergent learning is really designed to support that kind of experimentation. It's more than a set of tools, and principles like maximizing freedom to experiment can help you create the conditions for learning and adaptation in your environments. Especially in these turbulent times, the ground changes way too quickly to depend on decisions that have been made from afar and long ago, without the ability and freedom of everyone involved to adjust and learn as we go. So thank you so much